Alrighty, guys, we got Unity, we got Unity Hub, we got a project. Now it's time to deal with this information overload we're looking at. Okay? And that's totally normal to feel. I remember the first time I opened Unity, it was a lot, and that's okay. This is a bit of a longer video, so you may see me. I'm going to just take this moment looking over at my notes on the left here, just because I want to make sure I get to everything. The very first thing about Unity is how do we interact with this? If your view doesn't look exactly like mine, that's okay, but to get the closest way we can is if we come up to the top and go to Window, Layouts, and hit Default, you should see everything like layout. Now, it is default, so ideally, you're probably, probably already there. But just in case you weren't, that's okay. Now, what did that do, really? Because we saw the whole screen flash on mine. It may not have like really changed anything for you. The reason that I'm doing that is because generally, as you're working with different developers, you may notice that they have different things in different places. We have, the way I look at Unity is it's just a bunch of windows kind of put together in a grid, right? We can see that we have this hierarchy window here, this scene window here, the inspector window over here, project window over here. And they kind of have like these little tab things, right? And we can see, for example, with the scene window, that we actually have the game tab right next to it. And if I click that, you get a different window. The cool thing about these, I'm going to start with the project tab because it's one of the most important, is you can drag them around and move them. Now that's by clicking on the tab and moving it around. If I wanted it to the, oh, that looks awful. There we go. It took a second to figure that one out. But I have it next to my console. I can put it over here. I can give it its own window, and it does not like me moving the project tab, apparently. But yeah, so that's what you can do, right? You can also, most of the time, whenever you see like a vertical line like this one right here, you can drag it to make it bigger. Same thing here. I can drag this to make my hierarchy bigger. I can take this and make it bigger this way. These are very important skills, and I know you might be thinking, yeah, okay, this is obvious, but you'd be surprised how often it is a little bit, of a, with all the information overload here, it may be a little weird to like run into that. I want to try one thing real quick. Oh, I didn't do it. Okay, come back to what this lock does later, because it's going to save you lots of time. But okay, let's start with our project tab. Now, I mentioned in the last video that one of the most important things for any developer is being able to understand file structure, being able to understand where things are. This project tab is your window into your Unity project in File Explorer. So what does that mean, right? Or Finder if you're on Mac. But what does that mean, right? If I were to right-click on Scenes and go to Show in Explorer, we'll see that I'm in the My Pool project for the tutorial, yeah. I'm in the Assets folder, as you can see right here, and I have my Scenes folder, as you can see right here. And when I open up the Scenes folder here, and open up the Scenes folder here, let's bring that back up, we have the exact same thing. Now it has this meta file, which is a little interesting. We don't really need to mess with that too much, but we actually don't have to mess with anything in here right now. But we do have this sample scene. All this assets folder is in here is a window into your File Explorer. So it's incredibly important for you to keep this organized. A lot of the time, when you start making a game, you're going to be working on it for a while. And if you just keep throwing things into the top level of the assets folder, so if I go and just make a, oh, I don't know. Let's see what happens when I do this. When I make a sprite right here, if I had a bunch of sprites, a bunch of sound effects, a bunch of code, all in the assets folder, it's going to look kind of gross, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete that because we don't need it, is set ourselves up for success from the get-go, okay? I'm going to create a couple folders. So I can do that in a couple different ways. I can right-click in here and go to Create, and get all kinds of things. I know, lots of things. It's very intimidating. But we're just going to look at the very top and click folder. And I'm going to name it sprites. Okay. Another way you can do it is you have this little plus icon right here. That's in the left right there. I generally don't really use that. Another way, just to really drive home the File Explorer stuff, is if I go over here into my File Explorer and right click and make a new folder called scripts, we'll actually see it pop up in here, because again, these are just windows to the same thing, right? This is just where your files are in your project. So what I want you to do is, if you didn't follow along there, make a sprites and scripts folder, because that's going to become very important in the within the next few seconds, because we're going to drag in some sprites and actually get into what's going on here. Now, what we're going to do now is we're going to actually bring some sprites in. And we're going to put them in, you guessed it, the sprites folder. You should be able to go on to Canvas if you're one of my 110 students and pull in some sprites. If you're not and you're just watching this video because, hey, Unity tutorial, then by all means bring in whatever sprites you want. But you should be able to, well, where did my folder go? There it is. Go and grab the breakout art assets. Now, we can't drag in a zipped folder into Unity, so you do have to actually extract them. So I'm going to go ahead and extract them all into my downloads, and there they are, right? Look cool. So now, sprites in Unity are generally PNGs because they do have like a higher graphical fidelity. But the and there's other reasons. I'm not really an art guy, but I know that there are generally, we use PNGs instead of JPEGs just because of how they stay crisper and stuff like that. So what we're going to do is, you got a couple different options. You can drag them. You can go through like this whole import process with edit and import assets and all that stuff, but nobody does that. So we're going to just go ahead and grab these, and just did shift click and drag them not into my assets folder. It's important to keep things organized, but into my sprites folder. Okay. You have our background, our ball, our brick, and our paddle. So super easy, but you'll notice as I'm clicking on this, we are getting a little bit of things changing on the screen besides just, you know, things being highlighted. Over here, we're seeing that we have our information about the object that we brought in. And this is really important, and we're going to get into it in a second, but let's just pretend that it's not there for a moment. We're going to go ahead and look at our hierarchy window. I know I'm jumping left and right all over the place, but I think you guys can follow along. If we look at our hierarchy window, we'll notice that we are in our sample scene. Scenes in Unity are essentially the levels, the current level loaded in the game. So our sample scene is currently the one that we're in. Right now, what our hierarchy is it is kind of like a grocery list of items that are in this current scene. So if you could think of like a Mario level, right? You might have 10 Goombas. You might have all the like different environments. You'd have Mario. You'd have any special effects, all that stuff in your hierarchy. Right now, as you can see, we have a pretty empty area. We have just a camera. And we're going to get into what this camera is doing, but let's add something spicy in here, right? Let's go ahead and let's take our background, because obviously we're going to need that, right? And you can add it to your game, add it to your level two ways. You can drop it in the hierarchy, or you can drop it in the game or the scene window. Generally, I think it's a better idea to add it to the hierarchy, because that adds it to the position 0, 0, 0. So right at the origin of your game, right? Which is actually really important for us right now, because we're going to talk about like our sprites and our sizing. All right. I'm going to bring this inspector and make it a little bit bigger for us, because I'm going to click on this background. We'll bring this little preview up a bit because it's important for what we need to talk about. The background that we have here is a 1920 by 1080 background. Okay. And That's important because it, believe it or not, is one of the most common resolutions of game or computer monitors and TVs, right? If you start getting into 4K and stuff like that, great. This, if you were to run this on 4K, this sprite would end up getting stretched a little bit distorted. When you're playing on 4K and you notice textures aren't necessarily as crisp, that's generally what's happening. But what's more important is this pixels per unit section. Right now it's being set to 100 pixels. Now, this is something that took me forever to understand. So if you got to watch this a few times, that's okay. If you have questions, please ask either in class or in the comments section. But what this pixels per unit is doing is saying for every one Unity unit, we're going to render 100 pixels of this 1920 by 1080. You might be being like, whoa, Unity units, what is that? If we scroll in, each one of these little boxes, I'm actually going to turn off the background just because I think it's a little bit easier to see without it, is a Unity unit. So if we were to do some simple math, we could tell that our height of our background would be math 10.8 Unity units tall, right? And if we were to, let's say, take this and drag it right as close as we can to like the bottom of a Unity unit, we notice that it just about reaches the other one, which would make sense, right? 80% of the way. We go 10 blocks up. You can count them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and we almost get all the way to an 11th, but you know, I don't have a ruler to measure, but that's about 80% if I were to guess. I'm going to go ahead and set my background's position back to 0, 0 because I do want it in the middle. Now, I'm going to go ahead and bring my game view over. Okay, I want it side by side with my scene view. Now I'm going to do that one more time because this I've seen is something that gets people a couple every now and then. Is I'm going to bring it and I can drag it. I can just have it floating if I want, right? We talked about this in earlier in the video that you can drag things around. I'm going to drag it and bring it here and make sure I'm all the way zoomed out. Now this does not look like what we would expect. All right, and the reason is because Unity generally starts us in something called free aspect. This little drop down controls what our aspect ratio is. All right, aspect ratio is something that people get a little bit confused about, but it's basically saying let's take our resolution and bring it down into a ratio, right? The most common resolution, and we can tell that Unity knows this, is 16 by 9. How can we tell Unity knows this? It's right underneath the free aspect. I'm going to tell you this now. You almost never want to be working in free aspect because it gives you like a false sense of what your game is going to look like when you actually start playing it in a build. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the 16 by 9. And we notice that it hasn't really changed much, but if we look at our background, there's this red border, right? And it doesn't really connect. It's not really like showing that here. The reason for that is because of our camera. Our camera is what actually renders everything to our game view. Okay, it takes whatever's within this box and it's doing this box and rendering it specific way because we chose 2D, right? The cool thing about Unity is it was a 3D engine to start. I'm going to hit this button and I suggest you don't because you never want to be, when you're making a 2D game, never want to be really working outside of 2D. But a 2D game in Unity is just a 3D game in a flat plane. So, which is pretty cool in my opinion. You can do some cool stuff with that. Now, the thing with it though, is this main camera has a couple variables, a couple things we can mess around with on the side here. I'm going to start with one that's really easy to see. And this is our, let me actually take a step back. This is our inspector window. As you can see, when I keep turning the background off, I do that by going to the inspector, hitting this little checkbox. This is what allows us to turn objects on and off in the game, and you can do that through code. Remember that because it's going to be useful. But all of this stuff are different things that we mess around with in code, in game, all kinds of stuff. And what they're called is components. This transform is a component. The sprite renderer is a component. Our main camera has a transform. Every game object in Unity has a transform of some kind. It also has a camera, obviously. That's why it's called camera. And an audio listener that allows for audio to actually be played through your speakers. One thing that's really easy to see how powerful these components are is this background option. You know, we have this blue background, which ideally we're not going to see. What this is mostly just when there's nothing there, what does the camera show the game, right? In this case, it's blue. My favorite color is green, despite my hair. I'm going to go ahead and make it green just because, I don't know, I like green. But you can see that this changes aspects of our camera. Now, I'm going to bring the background back by green. And what we'll see is there are a couple variables here that we can mess around with. We have this size variable, and if I were to mess around with it, we can see there's the green background again. We can really start checking to see where is a good place for our good size for our camera to be. Now, I'm not a fan of math. I know game developers should love math. It's okay if you don't. I don't particularly, but there is a good way for us to figure out what our camera size should be, because the size, what it does is it is the height of your camera, not the width, right? Because you might be thinking, oh, shouldn't my camera have two variables, one for the width, one for the height? There are variables on here that you can mess around with for that. This width and height here, it's saying that the ratio should stay the same right now, but if I were to mess with the well, there we go. There's the width, and I can make it smaller. I can make it wider, but I can't make it wider than the height, which is actually interesting to me. You generally don't mess around with that. If I make the height bigger, what happens? Oh, no, but I can make it smaller. You can get some really weird stuff going on with that. Don't touch it. Pretend I didn't touch it. But how do we get the size right? Well, if we know that the size is all about the height, and we know the height of our background is 1080, that's what this one right here is, right? And we're doing 100 pixels per unit. If we were to say 1080 divided by 100 gives us 10.8. We know that the main camera's height is our size from the origin up. Okay, so that's half of the height of what the camera is actually going to show. So half of 10.8 would be 5.4. And we get a perfect, as long as our camera is at 0, 0, we'll talk about this -10, but it should be -10. We should have a perfect view of our background. So, again, rewatch it. I know I ramble a little bit. I tend to do that. But go ahead, if you got lost, go and rewatch that. And now we're going to actually get into a little bit more about making new game objects. Okay, before we get into any game objects, we're actually going to talk about how do we move around in our scene view. We're going to nab our game view and move it, well, not there, up here. How do we actually maneuver this, right? Because it is kind of tricky sometimes. If you're on a Mac, I suggest always working with a mouse in Unity. It doesn't have to be a great gaming mouse with all the buttons. It just has to be something with a scroll wheel and 2 buttons, whether you're on Mac or on PC. It's going to be so much easier for you. What I generally do in order to zoom in and zoom out with the mouse, yep, it's just with the scroll wheel, right? And it's going to zoom in wherever your cursor is, so I can get real close to this background and then I can zoom back out. By holding down your scroll wheel, if it's a button, you can pan around, which is great. You can also do that with the arrow keys if you don't have a mouse with a scroll wheel. You can also do it with right click on a mouse. As you make your games and they get bigger, you're going to eventually end up, way out here and not really be working on a bit of a level that's out here or something like that, and want to be able to get back to something very, very quickly. For example, if I want to get back to my background right here, I don't want to have to, drag myself all the way there. I can double click on my background and it'll take me right to it, which is super, super useful and will save you tons of time. The next thing I want to get into is these tools right here, because they are incredibly important. We have our drag tool. You can click on that and then use left click to pan around. It's a little bit inefficient because, I mean, it's just so much quicker just to right click. But then we have this move tool. You can still pan around with right click, but you can move your objects more precisely by grabbing onto these different, arrows and whatnot. And if we were in 3D, again, don't do this, stay in 2D, you can move it in a 3-dimensional as well. So the thing with that, though, is you're not going to get exactly right. And a lot of the time, we just did that math to figure out how big our camera should be. We want it to be exact. When we're moving things with these arrows, you'll notice in the top right over here, I'm changing the transform's position. So that's saying, hey, the transform, let me take a step back, keeps track of every game object. And that's what this is. This background is a game object. Everything in the hierarchy is a game object. The transform tracks its position, its rotation, and its scale. So generally, though you might use this for like placing things, to start, like getting it in the general right place, you generally will come here to go ahead and place it exactly where you want it. In this case, I want my background to be at 0, 0, 0. But yeah, so the other things we have is we have this rotate tool. Same deal. You can use it to rotate. I can get some really cool, weird, 3D rotation if I wanted to. I'm just going to undo that though. But again, you can rotate things here. This is our scale tool if I wanted to scale things up. I'm going to tell you right now, don't do that. You'll notice if I click on the middle here and scale up, my pixels, my actual art starts getting really crunchy, right? You start seeing artifacts and stuff like that because it's not meant to be scaled up. We've all made memes. We've scaled up images to make them look super crispy. They don't need to be, our games don't need to look like that. We want to look a little bit more professional. This tool does kind of the same thing. It's used a little bit differently when you're in, it's used for UI mostly. And there are reasons that you would scale that we'll get into later. It's a little bit more advanced. For right now, you'll want to just keep things the way they are at 1:1:1 scale. This last tool, ignore it. They took all these tools, smooshed them together into one. So you have your rotate, your move, your scale all in one. It's really gross. I don't know why they do that. If you think it's cool, you can use it, but I feel like I'd try and move and then grab the scale and yeah, I'm gonna stop rambling. But let's make another game object, right? Let's go ahead and drag our ball in. Uh-oh. It's behind it. Or it's not there. I kind of gave it away right there. It's behind it, which is not ideal. Now, I did talk about how in Unity, Unity is a 3D game engine. If I go and hit the little 2D button, we'll see, hey, there he is. He's rendering behind it, which is a little goofy. I want to turn 2D back on. I could take its Z position and move it up, or I'm sorry, move it down. And let me actually explain that, because it even gets me, as you can just see. The camera, we're going to go out of 2D just for this explanation, is at -10, okay? That's its Z position. So you could think of it as like a cameraman recording a movie or something like that, right? It took 10 steps back away from our background and is rendering everything into infinity. But our background is at 0, 0, 0. So it makes sense that if I want the ball to render over the background, I should move it closer to the camera. So if here's the background, let's see if I can get this. Here's the background, here's the camera at, here's the background at 0, here's the camera at -10. I'd want my ball to be somewhere in here, so between 0 and -10. You could do that. And it wouldn't be wrong. Excuse me, sorry. Um, but it wouldn't be right because generally, once we start adding physics and whatnot, you don't want to have to rely on lining everything up on the z-axis. It's a headache that you just don't want. We have, I'm going to go back to 2D, some better tools for it. And this is part of the reason why I started going into the hierarchy, right? Or the inspector. Because we have something called the sprite renderer. Now, if you've worked in Photoshop, if you've worked in any kind of visual editor, you've probably encountered the concept of layers before. And if you haven't, that's okay. But layers are essentially ways for the computer to know, hey, this should always be over that, or this should always be behind that. And we have that same tool in Unity, and it's really, really powerful. There's two different types of layers, and I'm going to tell you, this layer up here, up in the top right, is not at all what I'm talking about. We will eventually get to that one, but it's different. We want to go to our sprite renderer with our ball selected. We want to go to our sprite renderer, go to additional settings, and set its order and layer to 1. And you'll see it popped right there. It's over. Now it's over the background because the background's order and layer is 0. So it counts up, right? So it starts at 0 and then it renders the next thing and then it renders the next thing. Now this sorting layer, we only have the default sorting layer, okay? What I would suggest, and you could think of the sorting layer as folders, right? So if I have 2 folders, one called default, and then I have another folder called backgrounds, and I put it on top, and I have another background called gameplay, and I put it on top, I'd have 3 folders, right? I'd have default, sorry, I wasn't in the camera, default, environment, or background, whatever I called it, I don't have it written down here, and then gameplay. So if I had default with an order and layer, objects on the default sorting layer with objects that are at 0 and 10 and 99 for their order and layer, they would always render under the environment stuff. And same deal with environment stuff. If I had stuff in the environment sorting layer that was 0, a billion, a trillion with its order and layer, it would always render underneath my gameplay stuff. So I would encourage you to go ahead and make those sorting layers. We're going to get to this little inspector here. The inspector is going to change. That's okay. We want to make sure we're in sorting layers, not this layers. Again, looks intimidating. There's a bunch of stuff there. We don't want to look at that yet. I'm going to go ahead and make a sorting layer for my environment. I'm going to make a sorting layer for my gameplay elements. Now, that didn't actually do anything to our game objects, okay? So I have my background and I have my ball. They're both still on default, but what it did do is it gave me new options in the sorting layer. I'm going to click on environment, and we can see exactly what I was talking about before. It's still at 0, but because the ball is on default, it's always going to be rendering behind it. Now, you want to be careful with how many sorting layers you have. You don't want a new sorting layer for every game object, but you could group like-minded things together. For example, in this game, it's going to be like a breakout game, right? So we might have our ball, the paddle, and the bricks all on our gameplay elements. But we might want the ball to render behind the bricks or behind the paddle, or the paddle to render behind the ball, or, anything like that. So it's kind of like little pockets of we can have our gameplay elements here and mess with their order and layer. And it keeps us, like I said at the beginning with our folders, organized. But yeah, so something we haven't done yet is we haven't played our game. We have a ball now, we have a background, and we haven't talked about the big play button up at the top of the screen. If I hit play, oh, it starts doing something. We have a really interesting game. It's cool, right? Yeah, not really. But this is how you play your game, right? In Engine, right? If you've seen gameplay tutorials about how, in-engine gameplay and stuff like that, a lot of the time they're recording a window like this. So, or, you know, something like that. But right now we don't really have anything going on. We can't do anything. I can mash the keyboard, nothing happens. Don't mash your keyboard, you might accidentally somehow unplay, you know, might have a hotkey or something like that. But the tricky thing with play mode, and this is super important, and I promise it's gonna happen to you. I guarantee it, because I've been working in Unity forever, and it happens to me. Is with my game, you know, playing, if I'm like, I want to move this so it starts in the middle because that's better, right? And I unhit play, it doesn't keep those changes. It's very great for testing, right? And there are some things that will keep changes, very few, and that's kind of like more of an advanced topic we could talk about another time. But 99.9% of things you do in play mode do not persist outside of play mode. So I can go ahead and test, hey, the ball starting in the middle is cool. Let me get out of play mode, drag it over. Now, we've done a lot of work so far, so I'm going to hit Control S to save, make sure that everything's saved, and go from there. So the game is kind of boring. So let's do something about that. I'm going to go to my ball with my ball selected. I can tell that it's selected because it says ball in the inspector. And if I look at my sprite render, yep, that sure is the ball sprite. I'm going to close that. I'm going to do something called adding a component. We already talked about how our camera comes with the camera component, the transform component, the ball comes with the transform component, the sprite renderer. We're going to add something called a rigid body. Now, going back to what I said earlier about how Unity is started as a 3D game engine, you can notice that there is a rigid body and a rigid body 2D here. We're going to want that rigid body 2D. Okay. And what this does is this makes our ball a physics object. It means forces given to us by the physics engine in Unity are going to affect the ball, such as gravity. So if we were to hit play now, we're going to see the ball starts falling. And if I were to, I don't know, make gravity negative, we would, I made it too far negative. Let's bring it back down. Make it positive again. It's going to, maybe. I hope that I would get it to come back, but I think it's too, oh, it is falling. We can see it falling here. And it just zoomed past. All right, we're going to stop with the gravity shenanigans. But we do get the ball falling, right? But it doesn't really, like, again, this isn't a game. This isn't fun. This isn't doing anything for us. That's because there's no collision, right? Rigid bodies give you physics, but it doesn't actually make you do anything with the physics besides things like gravity and drag and stuff like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to add another component. This is kind of the game with Unity, is we're going to be adding all kinds of components all the time. I'm going to search for circle collider 2D because our ball is a circle, right? I'm going to go ahead and zoom in on it here. Let me go and actually add that circle collider. And we'll notice it's kind of hard to see, but a very faint green line. You can play with the size of it by going to, let me close that, the layer radius. You can see if I wanted a really inaccurate collider, I can mess around with it. I'm going to hit Control C so I can bring it back. But that is the collider for our circle, right? I'm going to go ahead and hit play now. And I want you, hopefully you know what's going to happen. Nothing, right? Why? And this is for, we haven't started programming yet, but I want you to start thinking like step by step, what is happening here, right? We've given the ball gravity. We've given it collision. Why is it just falling into nothing? Well, in order for things to collide, there has to be two things, right? We have our ball. What's our other thing? We have a lot of options for how to do that other thing. I'm going to show you a couple of them. We have our background, and we can add a edge collider 2D. You might be like, whoa, that's just a line. It is just a line. But if we hit play, now it's a starting point. You see the ball doesn't fall. It collided with that line. Okay? It's progress, right? And you gotta take it baby steps. The edge collider is a little bit fancy. We saw how with the circle collider we can mess around with the radius of it and change the size of it. Well, the edge collider is a little bit different. We can go ahead and see different points on the edge collider, right? We have one that's -6, negative 9.6, and one that's 9.6. They because we put it on the background, it said, okay, how big do I have to be to reach the entire width of the background? If we're going to take our background and divide it by the 100 pixels per unit that we looked at earlier, we'd get 19.2, right? And we know that, like, we're looking at the 2 points, they have to go all the way across with 0 being in the middle. So that means we have to go from 0 in 2 directions. So 19.2 divided by 2 would give us 9.6. So here's our negative 9.6. Here's our 9.6. It's easy. It's as easy as that. Now, if we want to see it change a little bit, we can go ahead and rotate this. And I believe if we do rotate it, let's see. We're going to see that the ball falls and it rolls. Look at him go. He's going, he's going, he's going, he's going. Oh no, it didn't actually stop. Which we wouldn't expect it to, right? Because it's just kind of going as a ramp. We can go ahead and mess around with this. You can see that it has this size variable, right? I want you to, don't worry about the specifics here, but I want you to remember the name array, because what this size variable is saying how many elements, that's what these guys are in our array of points, okay? And an array is just a list of things, okay? We're going to get into that later when we talk more code, but it's just something to keep in the back of your mind. I'm going to go ahead and hit 4 here, because we know we have 4 corners of our, our box. And I'm going to make this 0 again. We know for a fact that we need to wrap this edge collider all the way around our background. So I'm going to keep my element 1 at 9.6, but the height, we can do the same kind of math we did before, right? We can do the 1080 divided by 100 is 10.8 divided by 2 is 5.4. And we'll see that it goes straight up into the corner, right? And same deal here. I'm going to have this next one be 5.4. And then I'm going to have my next corner. We could think I'm going 1, 2, 3, 4. Ooh, I just realized I made a mistake. 1, 2. So that's our second element. 3. Well, this is going to have to be 9.6. But this time, negative 5.4. You'll see that it went all the way down to the bottom. It's kind of hard to see, but we do have the little green line there. I'm actually going to make these 9.8 just for the time being so we can see them a little bit better. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm not going to do that. I want to keep the numbers right. We're going to turn off the sprite render, because a cool thing you can do is you can turn off these individual bits. All right. So we have our green line from here to here. I'm going to actually just bring it so that our scene view is a little bit bigger. We have our green line from here to here. So now we got to go, okay. Let's go to the next corner, which would give us negative 9.6. Not up there. That's not what we want. Negative 5.4. And I lied. We actually need 5 elements because we need to finish the box, right? 9.6. Or no, I'm sorry. Still negative 9.6. But we want 5.4. Now you'll see we get a closed box here. Now what's going to happen? Let's turn the background sprite renderer back on. Go ahead and play it. Whoa. It zoomed me in. I don't appreciate that. And it stops right at the bottom, right? Which is awesome. That's exactly what we wanted. Now that is an awesome way of going about doing it. Now, the thing about game design is there's all kinds of ways to do things. I personally don't really like edge colliders. So, a little bit of a advanced method. Some people might think it's less advanced. I'm going to make some new game objects. We have our background, right? And we put the edge collider on it. I'm going to make an empty game object by right-clicking on my background and creating an empty. Okay? And I just did it by default, autopiloted in my brain just because I've done this quite a few times. And make a right collider. And you'll notice that there's no collider on these things, right? When I click on the background, I have a sprite renderer, I have a transform, and I have an edge collider. On my left collider, I have a transform. My right collider, I have a transform. I'm going to make two more. And you can quickly duplicate these guys just by doing Control or Command if you're on Mac, D. And I'm going to rename them to top collider and bottom collider. Okay. Now with all of them selected, I'm going to shift click them. I'm going to add something called a box collider 2D. And we'll notice that I got a little box here. It's really cool. There's my left one. There's my right. I moved that the wrong way. My left one I'm going to put over here. My top one I'm going to put up here. And my bottom one I'm going to put up here. If I select them all, I see I have a couple boxes. Generally, and this is just a personal thing, probably because I'm old and have used Unity for too long, before they had edge colliders, I go about doing this. I've seen better performance with it, so it's just a little bit of you know, been using it long enough to know, but I generally would rather just do something like this. Let's move that. Let's put our right one right at the edge. You don't really need to worry unless you have a game that's going to be doing more, you know, have more outside of the view. You don't really need to worry about the overlapping we're going to have. In fact, I think it's generally a little bit better to have at least some overlap, so that way then you can verify your corners aren't going to get, you know, goofed up at all. And my washing machine just started doing something. So if you hear something in the background, don't worry about it. But both of these methods work just fine. Like I said, I've seen the edge collider act a little funky sometimes, so my default has always been doing box colliders, but both work. Now, I'm going to turn off, I'm actually going to remove my edge collider. Again, you can do it either way you want. Now, the cool thing about this is now we have a ball that will not exit our background, right? But it's still kind of boring. Doesn't really do anything. Let's make it, when I was a kid, I loved those little rubber bouncy balls, so we're going to do that. I'm going to make a new folder in my assets folder called, what do we want to call it? Materials. And what we're going to do in our materials folder is right-click, create, go to 2D, I know this might seem a little weird, and make a physics material 2D. Now, you might see this material option down here. That's not what we want, okay? That's a different kind of material, and I know it's a little bit weird, but we want physics material 2D. We're going to call this ball material. Now, you can rename these if you named it wrong. That's okay. But if you press F2 on it, if you right-click on it and hit rename, if you, I think, if you just click on the name a bunch of times, it's supposed to be a double click. It doesn't always work that way. You can rename it. That's absolutely fine. When we get into code, it's a little less fine. We'll talk about that once we get there. This ball material, when we click on it, has a couple things in the inspector for us. It has friction, you know, friction, just like if you've taken a physics class, stops things from moving like on ice, right? Like ice is the theoretical frictionless surface, right? That's why things slide across it. Um, we, in this case, are just going to set that to 0 because we do want our ball just to like be not get stuck on anything, not, you know, be messed around with. Bounciness is exactly as it sounds, right? We're going to set that to 1. Now, this doesn't do anything, right? We haven't actually given this material to the ball at all. Generally, I go about putting this in the rigid body. So that way then the rigid body knows, hey, when I make a collision, when I do something, I'm going to factor in how I react to it with this material, right? So I went ahead and I clicked on the ball, and I went ahead and dragged the ball material into there. Let's see what happens. And we see that it bounces up. Now, 1 means that it's going to bounce up exactly where it was when, and that's when we put it in the bounciness, exactly where it was when it started its descent, right? The different thing about it, though, and the bit of weirdness that we have going on here, because you'll notice it's getting higher and higher every time, is gravity is making it hit faster and faster. Oh, I hit the desk a little too hard. And faster and faster. So we're going to keep going and going and going. But this isn't really a game, right? It's a cool little simulation, but we haven't really done anything yet. That's because most games need code, and that's going to be in the next video. So, hey, now we're hitting the top. Anyway, we're going to go ahead and end this video. If you made this far, good job. Go get yourself a snack. Go take a drink. Make sure, you know, keeping healthy. And we'll get into scripts in the next video.